He gets insanely jealous, but in other ways, he seems entirely rational. In a group session one day, a young client named Marshall was recounting a confrontation with his partner that had occurred in the previous week. My wife and I had plans to meet in the lobby of the building where she works to go out for lunch. I was waiting around near the elevators, and when she finally came out, I saw that she'd been alone on the elevator with this good-looking guy. He had a look on his face, and she did too. I can't really describe it, but I could tell something was up. I said, "What was that all about?" And she pretended like she didn't know what I was talking about. That really peed me off, and I guess I kind of blew up at her. I may have gotten a little louder than I should have. I was mad though, and I was saying, "You were making it with that guy in the elevator, weren't you? Don't lie to me, you I'm not a fool." But she kept on playing dumb, saying she doesn't even know him, which is a crock. Marshall was extremely jealous. But I'd worked with him long enough to know that he wasn't crazy. He was lucid and logical in group, had a stable work history and normal friendships, and showed no signs of living in a world of fantasy or hallucination. He simply did not have symptoms of the type of serious mental illness that could convince a man that his wife could have sex in an elevator fully clothed and standing up between floors of a busy office building. Marshall had to know that his accusation wasn't true, and when I confronted him, he admitted it. Given that even very jealous abusers turn out to have a reasonable grasp on reality, why do they make these insane-seeming accusations? Is there something about acting crazy that they enjoy? What does this behavior accomplish for them? I answer these questions in Chapter 3, where we consider the issue of possessiveness. He succeeds in getting people to take his side against her. Martin, a man in his late 20s, joined my abuser group while also seeing an individual therapist. He told me the first day that he was confused about whether he had a problem or not, but that his longtime girlfriend, Ginny, was preparing to break up with him because she considered him abusive. He went on to describe incidents of insulting or ignoring Ginny and of deliberately causing her emotional pain to show her how it feels when she hurts me. He also admitted to times of humiliating her in front of other people, being flirtatious with women when he was mad at her, and ruining a couple of recent important events in her life by causing big scenes. He justified all of these behaviors because of ways he felt hurt by her. As a routine part of my assessment of Martin, I contacted his private therapist to compare impressions. The therapist turned out to have strong opinions about the case. Therapist: I think it's a big mistake for Martin to be attending your abuser program. He has very low self-esteem. He believes anything bad that anyone says about him. If you tell him he's abusive, that'll just tear him down further. His partner slams him with the word abusive all the time for reasons of her own. Jenny's got huge control issues, and she has obsessive-compulsive disorder. She needs treatment. I think having Martin in your program just gets her what she wants. Whew. I'm not sure who this is. Bancroft. There's a letter missing, but okay. So you've been doing couples counseling with them? Therapist: No, I see him individually. How many times have you met with her? She hasn't been in at all. You must have had quite extensive phone contact with her then. No, I haven't spoken to her. You haven't spoken to her. You've assigned Ginny a clinical diagnosis based only on Martin's descriptions of her? Yes, but you need to understand we're talking about an unusually insightful man. Martin has told me many details, and he's perceptive and sensitive. But he admits to serious psychological abuse of Ginny, although he doesn't call it that. An abusive man is not a reliable source of information about his partner. Thank you. What Martin was getting from individual therapy, unfortunately, was an official seal of approval for his denial and for his view that Ginny was mentally ill. How had he shaped his therapist's view of his partner to get her to adopt this stance? How can abusers be so adept at recruiting team members in this way, including sometimes ones with considerable status or influence, and why do they want to? These questions are the focus of Chapter 11, Abusive Men and Their Allies. During some incidents, he seems to lose control, but certain other controlling behaviors of his appear very calculated. Several years ago, a young man named Mark came to one of my abuser groups. When a client joins the program, I set behavioral goals with him as soon as possible. I often begin by asking, what are the top 3 or 4 complaints your partner has about you? Mark's response was, one of the things Aileen gets on me about the most is that she says I ignore her. She says I make her a low priority and always wants to do other things instead of be with her, so she feels like she's nothing. I like to have time to myself a lot, or to relax and watch television. I guess I kind of tune her out. Based on Mark's account, I wrote near the top of his behavior plan, spend more time with Aileen, make her a higher priority. Aileen was very difficult to reach by phone, but 3 weeks later she finally called me with a surprising story to tell. A few weeks before Mark started your program, I told him that I needed a total break from the relationship. I just couldn't take it anymore, the yelling and the selfishness. He won't even let me sleep. So I didn't even want to talk to him for a while. I had to have time away to get myself together. I reassured him that the relationship wasn't over and we'd work on getting back together in a couple of months after a breather. Then a couple of weeks later, he called me and said that he'd enrolled in an abuser program. He said that his counselor wants him to spend more time with me and had written it on a sheet, and that the program told him that being with me was part of how he needed to work on his issues. I wasn't ready for that yet at all, but I also didn't want to interfere with his program, so I started seeing him again. I want whatever's going to work best to help him change. I could have used a little more time apart to tell you the truth, but if that's what your program recommends. Mark had succeeded in twisting the abuser program to suit his own purposes. I explained to Aileen what had happened and apologized for the way my program had added to the many difficulties she already had with him. The high degree of manipulativeness that Mark used is not uncommon among abusive men, unfortunately. How can abusers be capable of such calculation, yet at other times appear to be so out of control? What's the connection? The answers can be found in Chapter 2, where we examine the excuses that abusive men use to justify their behavior. Sometimes he seems to be really changing, but it tends to vanish. Carl was a 26-year-old man who'd been arrested repeatedly for domestic assault and had finally served a few months in jail. He said to me in a group session, going to jail was the last straw. I finally got it, that I have to stop blaming my problems on everybody else and take a look at myself instead. People in jail said the same thing to me. If you don't want to be back in here, get real with yourself. I have a bad temper and kind of a mean streak, to tell you the truth, and I have to deal with it. I don't want to be back inside for anything. At the end of each counseling session, Carl would make comments such as, I can see that I've really got to work on my attitude, and I learned a lot tonight about how excuses keep me from changing. One night he looked at me and said, I'm really glad I met you, because I think if I wasn't hearing the things you're saying, I would be headed straight back to being locked up. You're helping me get my head on straight. I reached Carl's girlfriend, Peggy, by telephone and began to ask her about the history of Carl's problem with abusiveness. She sounded noticeably distracted and uncomfortable. I suspected strongly that Carl was listening to the conversation, so I made an excuse to wrap it up soon. However, when Carl was at my group the next week, I left my co-leader in charge of the session and slipped out to give Peggy another call to see if she would feel freer to talk. This time she gave me an earful. "Carl comes home from your program in a rage every week. I'm afraid to be around the house on Wednesday nights, which is when he has his group session. He says the program is total bullshit and that he wouldn't have to be sitting there getting insulted by you people if I hadn't called the police on him. And he says that I know the fight that night was my fault anyhow. He says he especially hates that guy Lundy. A few nights ago, I told him to stop blaming it on me, that he has to go to counseling, and he slammed me up against the door jamb and told me if I didn't shut up, he'd choke me. I should call the police, but he gets sent away for 2 years this time because he's on parole, and I'm afraid that would be enough to get him to kill me when he got out." Peggy then went on to describe the history of beatings she'd suffered at Carl's hands before he went to jail. The black eyes, the smashed furniture, the time he had held a knife to her throat. He invariably had blamed each attack on her, no matter how brutal his abuse or how serious her injuries. After speaking with Peggy, I returned to the group session where Carl went through his usual routine of self-exploration and guilt. I of course said nothing. If he knew Peggy had told me the truth, she would be in extraordinary danger. Soon after this, I reported to his probation officer that he was not appropriate for our program without giving the real reason. Carl created the appearance of learning a great deal at each session, and his comments suggested serious reflection on the issues, including the effect of his abuse on his partner. What was happening each week inside his mind before he got home? How can an abuser gain such insight into his feelings and still behave so destructively? And how does real change happen? We'll return to these questions in Chapter 14, The Process of Change. These are just a very few of the many confounding questions that face anyone, the partner of an abusive man, a friend, or a professional who's looking for effective ways to respond to abusive behavior. I came to realize through my experience with over 2,000 abusers that the abusive man wants to be a mystery. To get away with his behavior and to avoid having to face his problem, he needs to convince everyone around him and himself that his behavior makes no sense. He needs his partner to focus on everything except the real causes of his behavior. To see the abuser as he really is, it's necessary to strip away layer after layer of confusion, mixed messages, and deception. Like anyone with a serious problem, abusers work hard to keep their true selves hidden. Part of how the abuser escapes confronting himself is by convincing you that you are the cause of his behavior, or that you at least share the blame. But abuse is not a product of bad relationship dynamics, and you cannot make things better by changing your own behavior or by attempting to manage your partner better. Abuse is a problem that lies entirely within the abuser. Through years of direct work with abusers and their partners, I found that the realities behind the enigmatic abuser gradually came out into the bright light, forming a picture that increasingly made sense to me. The pages ahead will take you through the pieces that I watched fall into place one by one, including why abusers are charming early in relationships, but don't stay that way. What the early warning signs are that can tip you off that you may be involved with an abusive or controlling man. Why his moods change at the drop of a hat. What goes on inside his mind and how his thinking causes his behavior. What role alcohol and drugs play and don't play in partner abuse. Why leaving an abusive man doesn't always solve the problem. How to tell whether an abuser is really changing and what to do if he isn't. How friends, relatives, and other community members can help to stop abuse, and why many abusive men seem to be mentally ill, and why they usually aren't. We will explore answers to these questions on 3 levels. The first level is the abuser's thinking, his attitudes and beliefs in daily interactions. The second is his learning process, through which his thinking began to develop early in his life. And the third involves the rewards he reaps from controlling his partner, which encourage him to use abusive behavior over and over again. As we clear away the abusive man's smokescreen with these understandings, you will find that abusiveness turns out to be far less mysterious than it appears at first. Inside the abuser's mind, there's a world of beliefs, perceptions, and responses that fits together in a surprisingly logical way. His behavior does make sense. Underneath the facade of irrationality and explosiveness, there is a human being with a comprehensible and solvable problem. But he doesn't want you to figure him out. The abuser creates confusion because he has to. He can't control and intimidate you. He can't recruit people around him to take his side. He can't keep escaping the consequences of his actions unless he can throw everyone off the track. When the world catches on to the abuser, his power begins to melt away. So, we're going to travel behind the abuser's mask to the heart of his problem. This journey is critical to the health and healing of abused women and their children, for once you grasp how your partner's mind works, you can begin reclaiming control of your own life. Unmasking the abuser also does him a favor because he will not confront and overcome his highly destructive problem as long as he can remain hidden. The better we understand abusers, the more we can create homes and relationships that are havens of love and safety, as they should be. Peace really does begin at home.